It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are talking about Tomoe Gozen by Jessica Amanda Samuelson, the first novel in the Tomoe Gozen saga.
Indeed we are.
So, would you like to do the plot or shall I?
Well, there's this female samurai named Tomoe Gozen, and she has a lot of gender, and she goes through a lot of very strange adventures.
Okay, I feel like it should be made clear that even though that Tomoe is a samurai, she is not a samurai from Japan. She is a samurai from
Nippon, the mystical alternate reality.
The author makes it clear that this is what Japan dreams of itself. This is a land made up of Japan's own reflexive myth making. Sorry, I'm a little tired. We'll do our best.
We'll do our best.
And that explains perhaps a few things about this book. Are there lesbians in this book?
Oh, yeah.
And wizards?
Oh, yeah. No, this one has bona fide lesbians and bona fide wizards. I mean, they don't go around saying, I identify as a lesbian, but these women sure are into other women and nobody else.
Yes. And the wizards are just 100% wizards.
Like, they're actual wizards. They're called wizards or magicians or something.
Finally, at long last, an actual wizards versus lesbians book in which wizards fight lesbians.
Yeah.
This is also, I think, this is a retro episode also, and I think this is the oldest book that we've done so far for the podcast, unless I'm mistaken.
I'm pretty sure the Renunciate books are older.
Ah, yes, at least one of them is older. Although I think this may be older than than two of the series. This one came out in 1981 and is therefore from before either of us were born.
It's true.
But it feels very familiar for reasons which we'll go into shortly.
I mean, I should note, it feels familiar to me because I read this back when I was like 13 and I couldn't remember any of the details, but it somehow still made a deep and lasting impression. Mostly, ironically, I wondered if I'd made it up.
I can see why you might have wondered if you'd made it up. I had never heard of this book before, but I felt in familiar territory with it. So why should you read this book?
There's just so much going on. It's nonstop. Things happen. It's really, I don't know, it's interesting, and boy, is it full of interesting gender things. And it's entertaining.
Yeah. No. This book is why you should read this book. If you like swords and sorcery.
Right.
This book is just like a Conan the Barbarian book, except in Japan starring a lesbian.
Yeah.
It's like big fights, wars, blood, guts, magic,
demons,
things happening one after another, demons, and like
beautiful
enormous
women.
amounts of like unreconstructed fascist and racist ideas.
Which
there it is.
Segues into why you shouldn't read this book, which is
so this book is full of unregurgitated of unthought or just plain regurgitated fascist and racist ideas, and that's just the way it is. But I want to talk a little bit when we get into the spoiler zone about why I feel inclined to forgive this one. Like not completely, but just, more than I would a different book of this kind.
Because
for some things,
my theory,
and less for other things.
Yes, well, to some degree, we have to forgive this book so that we can forgive our past selves.
Yes, exactly. You have to be. This is a book that a 13-year-old might really love. And we have to sort of be kind to ourselves in that respect, while acknowledging that it is
kind of racist.
deeply problematic in a number of ways. Kind of racist.
Right. Okay,
Jesus
but here's
Christ.
The thing. It is, when I went back to it, I was like, oh no, this book is going to be way more racist than I remember. Not that I can remember anything from it except for a couple of like images. And I have to say it is slightly less racist than I expected it to be. no, sorry. Let me rephrase it. It is slightly less racist against the Japanese than I expected it to be. It's more racist against the Chinese than I expected it to be.
Oh yeah,
but that's mostly because I'd forgotten.
Right.
The wizard is Chinese.
One of the wizards is Chinese, but he's incredibly Chinese. It's something. Yeah. So like this is, I would say that this book is the sort of social order that it describes is like one part, Conan the Barbarian, slay your enemies and drive them before you and hear the lamentations of the women. One part like a smitten nerd's understanding of Japanese history, and one part just weird gender stuff.
Yes, absolutely. This is if you were ever into the Legend of Five Rings games, card games and role-playing games as a teenager, then this will feel very familiar, including the bizarre racism against the Chinese.
I mean, it's bizarre is not maybe the right word. The right word
Yes.
may be completely expected racism against the Chinese.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, the completely expected racism against the Chinese. The wholly regurgitated unthinking racism against non-Japanese people.
Yes.
But and just it's also worth pointing out that this can technically be construed as fan fiction because Tomoe Gozen is in fact a character in Heike Monogatari.
You gotta love it. Content warnings.
Oh boy.
Besides cringe.
There's a lot of violence.
If you're an otaku, you'll cringe. But yes, a lot of blood, a lot of like really cartoony violence, mutilation, threat of torture,
threat of sexual. I think that there's threat of rape, though it's referred to so delicately that it's not entirely clear.
Yes, no, this book is like in a sort of a classic fashion. This book is extremely explicit about its violence and extremely delicate and dainty about its sex.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see. I think that pretty. Oh yeah, and we've mentioned the racism, which I must mention again because there's a lot of it.
Boy, is there a lot of it.
But yes, I think that covers the content warnings. So shall we head off to the spoiler zone
Let's head off to the spoiler
talk
zone.
about this thing?
Oh, there is also possession, mind control, like body.
There is mind control and possession.
Yeah.
Yes, that is true.
Making this really,
which makes this really a wizard versus lesbians book right here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. This is the.
Yeah. So okay. Spoiler zone goes here. So in the course of discussing this book, I made a lot of very broad historical statements, and I had to go back and make long jingles explaining what I meant in each case. So there's a lot of that here in the spoiler zone. So, like, I mean, God, where to even begin?
You know what? Let's start with the two swords, because that is one of the few things I retained from this book. And even at the time, I was like, I did not have in any way the vocabulary or like self-reflection to articulate it. But even at the time, I was like, this is saying things about gender that are making me upset. Because the thing about Tomoe Gozen is that she came back from China. None of this is in Heike Monogatari.
Yes.
So it's just basically her name and that she's a woman samurai. But anyway, so she came back from not China with two swords. So instead of doing the traditional samurai thing of having the one big sword and then like the little thing, the short sword or the knife, she has two equal swords. They're equal length, thus showing the duality of her soul. And this, she does not see a problem with this. Everybody else sees a problem with this. And eventually this proves to be a fatal crack in her defenses, which allows her to be defeated.
Yes. It was precisely at that point, because up to this point, like, me and Kiana had been reading this on a road trip and sort of having fun with how, silly and over the top it was. And then we got to the end of that arc and I was like, yeah. I mean, I've been picking up a lot of like overt racist and fascist stuff, but I didn't quite expect it to also be bad about gender. um, and it was at that point where we sort of laid it down, and I finished it on my own for the podcast rather than for my own entertainment. But yes, no,
Right, like this is not only is this proto Wizles, but it's also kind of proto Turfy, which is fascinating
yeah,
because this is a book that has multiple genders, like, or has like multiple kinds of gendered relationships,
it
including
is. I'm.
feudal lady and, handmaiden slash vassal.
It's true, although in a slightly different direction than you might expect. And this is why lesbian relationships can't be boiled down to heterosexual concepts of gender relations. 'Cause even though Tomoe is not the feudal lord in this scenario, she's the servant, she's definitely the top, and the masked one. So yeah, no, I wanted to bring up also the storytelling, where the prince disguises himself as a geisha in order to infiltrate the palaces of his enemy, right? And this is sort of presented as a heroic tale by the storyteller, but then when the storyteller tries to make up a story about Tomoe Gozen, who disguised herself as a man to go amidst the geishas, he gets mutilated for his trouble by Tomoe, who is not having that.
Yes.
And wants to make it very clear that she is entirely a separate category than this sort of switchy, gender-bending prince who won by guile and feminine wiles as much as by martial skill, right?
Right. Like, this is, there's so much interesting gender stuff in here, and yet the narrative keeps coming back around to no normative gender of this weird gender system that I've kind of made up based on, my 1970s weeaboo idea of Japan.
Yes. The the problem is that Tomoe has taken her two souls, which is, she describes her swords as her souls, right? Being two-souled
Right.
is, among a lot of different peoples of the world, a way to describe being gender nonconforming or,
And of
queer
course,
in another way.
and of course, having two swords is sometimes a way of referring to people being bisexual.
Yes, indeed. And this is, in fact, treated as you say, as a fatal weakness in her. And one of the reasons for this prototurfism, which really goes well with the rest of the book's general feeling about men and women, which, is like, there's a very clear divide in swords and sorcery, right? But also is because of the milieu she's in, because as this is a product of a 1970s, 1980s otaku, it follows anime rules. And the person who isn't wielding a single katana never wins in Japanese martial arts stuff.
Right.
And so she can't actually be the strongest if she doesn't just have the one sword.
Right.
It's just a rule of the universe. Like, that never ever changes, It's always the monsters and the monstrous people who wield all the weird weaponry.
Yep. And by monstrous
and
people, we mostly mean Chinese people and Koreans.
Yes, and that is definitely carried through in this book as well. The
Right.
demonic.
Because this one, this is interesting because it comes back sort of to what we saw in She Who Became the Sun, where it's so clear that gender is socially constructed, and in places where you have two different nationalities clashing and overlapping, you also get clashing in their gender systems.
Yes.
And She Who Became the Sun handles this in an incredibly, thoughtful and interesting and engaging way. And Tomoe Gozen basically says there's the gender system of not Japan, which is the right one. And then there's the gender system, and then there's like the creepy transgressive gender system of the not Chinese. And that's bad. And that will be your fatal weakness.
Yes, it's the corruption in the mainland, And this is all sort of part of the when you think about like, Conan and the Barbarian stuff, you think about sort of, the it's always like the barbarian, fells warriors with ease, but is always like threatened by magic, and much the same that Tomoe is threatened by magic in this book, right?
Right.
And magic is always coded as being soft power.
Yes. And which is why,
power.
like, wizards in traditional sword and sorcery stuff, unlike in a lot of Wizless stuff, tend to be very, like, swishy, effeminate, gay-coded.
Exactly. And so it's the fear of a system which might challenge the barbarian system, which is that, the strongest and the most determined and the most, active survive, and everybody else is, either a victim or a supporting character.
Right. Well, it's this idea that, like, civilization and really, like, cosmopolitanism and sophistication are inherently emasculating and thus bad.
Yes. And of course, this is coded with anti-Semitism. Depending on what you're reading, it's coded with racism here, and in a lot of other things, coded with fear of femininity, fear of like anything less than a sort of fascist masculine ideal, or proto-fascist, because this actually predates fascism. So, it's kind of nice to see this book is incredibly unsubtle with it.
Yeah.
So if you want to investigate it, and the book is also fun to read. So if you want sort of a primer in this stuff,
Right.
And it's got lesbians, so,
Yeah.
If you're sort of interested in getting a real sense of what this kind of narrative is like and what kind of ideas it pushes, you got one right here.
Yeah.
And I also think, like, weirdly, we've, for the last, couple of months, we keep being like, is this a parody or is this on, purpose? Obviously, this book isn't trying to make any points.
No.
But
at least this book is trying to make points, but this book is not. This is not a satire.
This isn't a satire of this sort of thing. It's just trying to do this sort of thing, except with lesbians. But it does sort of give itself an out, because it has a foreword explaining what Nippon is, It says, no, this isn't Japan. Japan exists. This is a parallel universe, which is made of the dream.
Yeah. It is very Zhuangzi. But the thing is, this book would give itself a much better out if it was like, this is, other cultures' dream of Japan, which is why it's so weird and, Orientalist. But no, this has to be Japan's dream of itself. And it is thus not particularly effective commentary in that sense either.
Enough with the politics. Right now we need to sing of our heroine's wondrous steed. It's Rasky the Wonder Horse. Will he chew off your face? Of course. He'll jump in the air, kick all of his legs, and then come down facing the opposite way. And then he'll be struck by lightning. So I kind of wanted to lay out the what we're dealing with here in terms of the sort of, there's two layers of racism here, right?
Right.
There is the racism of a Western person sucking up Japanese, mythology and history and sort of making a story out of it, which is wrong in most practical respects, but also reflects Japanese narratives self-mythologizing.
Yes.
And Japanese narratives racism against non-Japanese peoples. So, when we get, there's like this discussion that always happens is like, oh, the Japanese are so racist, says the white person, and, it's like, okay, the Japanese, you say, white person.
Right.
But also it is undeniable that Japan has problems with racism against particularly Chinese and Koreans.
And many other people in Asia.
And many other people in Asia.
Right. And I mean, part of this is that, it is useful to acknowledge that most, if a place has a dominant ethnic group, there's going to be some racism in that place, almost certainly. And,
I love that she managed to get a kick in at the savage Ainu of all things.
Right. Well, again,
it's like, come on. Did you need to do that?
Well, and again, it's because this is just like completely undigested So I think part of it actually is it's useful to keep in mind when you're engaging in, white people's or just like Japanese racist pop culture, that this is very much a thing that you can pick and choose. There's there's like actively anti-racist and anti-fascist Japanese media out there.
Of course there is.
Right. And so the part of what's interesting is the way that what comes to America tends to be the fascist stuff and the racist stuff.
Particularly back in like 1978 or 1980.
No, it absolutely is still going on today.
Oh yeah, no, but I'm just saying that like there are more avenues now to explore beyond what's available.
That's true.
We can like go on the internet now,
yes.
rather than be dependent upon what's been translated and what's been imported. So the way that this author view of Japan or Nippon is distorted is not entirely as much her fault as it would be as if this was a contemporary author.
Except that one of the things that I'm curious about is that what is, because of course it's not like translation is, what gets translated and what gets brought over is arbitrary. People make conscious decisions that they're going to translate and import these things. And so what is it about, Japanese nationalism that ends up being so attractive to a large segment of American nerds? And it's not even just like anime weeaboos, because again, like the Legend of Five Rings thing, media property did this as well.
It's an excellent question. Not one that I think that we can fully answer, but I think that one way of looking at it is that we always like, particularly like the kind of fascist dreaming that happens, like nationalist dreaming, or really any kind of like radical extremist dreaming about humanity, tends to posit like, okay, if we just got the social system right, we could make people who are like the people who I want, to see, right? I wish people were like this. And of course, if you do enough, if you like look far and wide, you will see that the problem is that humans are humans and that nobody is actually like this.
Right.
But a lot of nations and peoples like to tell themselves stories about themselves, particularly how they used to be, because we all have our old golden age stories. And I think that other nations' golden age stories are even more plausible to us than our own golden age stories.
I guess
because who knows what's going on over there.
Right. Like another nation's golden age stories, I think first of all, it's just like, novelty, the charm of novelty, but also that you don't grow up in that, since you don't grow up in that system, you haven't already started to think of counter arguments.
Yes. Or, you don't have other, banal or disappointing things already attached to these symbols.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you grew up in America and were thinking about cowboys, there's a lot of obvious cheese, that is going to get in the way of you just sort of accepting those cowboy narratives. Hopefully.
Right. It's the same way that, song lyrics in your second language are, at least for a while, less cheesy than lyrics in your native language until you eventually reach the point where your second language is good enough that you start to pick up cheese in that too.
Yeah, it's like, oh no. It turns out, there's a veil that goes away eventually, right? But And I think
Fortunately,
that,
I
like,
like cheesy song lyrics, so
yes, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying, but you're not going to be moved to, fascist imaginings by them, ideally.
no.
So so in this case, like, the whole Bushido thing that this book is all about, of course, was never a thing within the period that this book is supposedly set. Bushido was an invention, essentially an invention after the fact by Japanese nationalist propagandists to, create a sort of Japanese national identity and sort of martialism to push back against the West. The samurai, the samurai were in fact a military class, but as with any military class that doesn't have official government standing, it was mostly a protection racket. Um, there's a bunch of armed people wandering around trying to get money. None of this whole, like, mine honor is my life, and when my giri is in opposition with my watsutsuzi, I go mad.
Right.
Um, this is all a complete invention, but it sure sounds good to somebody who wishes the world was actually like that.
Yes.
You
And who
know?
wishes that there was a nice, clean code of behavior that, lays out all
Exactly.
the rules that they can follow, and that if they follow it, they get to be cool.
Okay, so Bushido is not actually a modern invention. It has been around in one form or another since, I don't know, the 12th century or something. The idea of Bushido as a unitary system of morals was propagated in the last part of the 19th century, though, for the purposes of creating a Japanese national military identity, and it is still used for that purpose even to this day among the vestigial Japanese armed forces. Pre-modern Bushido was not, however, a unified code of morals, and it was interpreted and practiced differently by different clans. Samurai was a class marker, distinct from peasant, noble, and merchant in the 17th century, and it's in that period that Bushido comes closest to the idea of chivalry, as we understand it. It was a sort of list of responsibilities and particularly privileges that in the end didn't really stop powerful people from doing whatever they wanted to do. So when you hear people talking about Bushido, take it with exactly as much of a grain of salt as you would if you heard somebody waxing poetic about the Knights Templar. I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that this sort of thing appeals to nerds.
Yeah.
Like, as much as I hate to say it, I think a lot of folks within our spectrum would really like it if there was as easy and clear a way of negotiating life as this that doesn't require, like, believing in Jesus or whatever. We will believe in something else instead. Actually, speaking of religion, I think it's really funny how distrustful this is of Buddhism because it's not really Japanese.
Right. No. So what's fascinating about this book, like, when we say that this book has bought in wholesale to Japanese nationalism, like, this is bought in wholesale to, the end of Taisho democracy, early Showa Japanese nationalism, where,
Yes.
which, like, this book is all about the conflict between the shogun and the emperor, and it's set in a sort of mythical post-Heian period.
Right.
But, like, where it's clear that, like, the emperor is on the side of right, and this is the way that this is just sort of imperial, like, 20th, like, late 19th, 20th century imperialist Japanese mythos is fascinating. Like, just it's so invested in that, in stuff that which is reading all this stuff back.
Yeah. Again, like, if you, the listener, are not familiar with Japanese history, which I actually have a degree in, kind of, so
Which we both actually have a degree in, kind of.
We both have, yeah, exactly. Which we both have a degree in, kind of, which is why I feel comfortable, like, talking about it to a certain extent. The idea that the emperor, the sort of, like, divine power of the emperor as a political figure thing, pretty much was invented in the mid 19th century. The whole,
Yep.
like, the imperial line is this unbroken divine line compared to the warring factions of China, which this book makes much of, is also probably an invention. And there was no Japan in that sense for most of that period before the Tokugawa shogunate. Um, oh god, okay. It's more or less true that the Japanese imperial line has existed since around the 7th century, plus or minus, like, little adjustments with adoption and, corrections of the historical record to make it a through line. However, the reason this is partially because the Japanese archipelago is extremely difficult to invade from the mainland due to the Divine Wind. But the major reason that the imperial family was always in place was that they never actually held any power. There were maybe one or two emperors before the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century who actually wielded any kind of political authority. And of course, Japan itself didn't really exist until the 16th century, and as like one nation. And then in 1600, the Tokugawa shogunate took over, and that was it for any real power on the imperial side until the Meiji Restoration. We good? And this book has like a very almost like early 20th century idea of Japanese military culture, because again, this keeps getting reified, and it's like the 7-year-old samurai who's gone to military school, who's a character in this book.
Yes.
Feels like it's out of like World War II era propaganda more than anything else.
Exactly. Like that, it's which including the fact that this is sort of reading the, sort of like Meiji Restoration politics back into medieval Japan.
Yeah, so like and
again, it sort of actively it's attempting to. It's a fairly, niche lesbian science fiction or fantasy book, but in a way, it sort of feels like book is trying to actively participate in the, like building of the Japanese imperial mythos.
Yeah, and because it's really clumsy about it, it makes it more obvious, which is again something valuable, I think.
Though to be fair, if you actually read the Meiji era stuff, it's real obvious.
Yes, it is, but that's not something that is available in. It's not something that is as immediately pick upable as this book.
Yes.
Is. Oh, and of course we've got a sort of a sprinkling of sort of mythical stuff from other mythical sources and like monomyth stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a singing sword in Japanese mythology that I don't remember, or is that straight from Arthuriana?
That feels straight from Arthuriana, but I don't know.
Right. Whatever. It's fine.
Our degree in Japan studies is an undergraduate BA, so.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not. And then
I switched teams.
I'm not a folklorist over here.
Right.
Yes, and I became a mailman eventually. But speaking of our college, actually, when I was reading this, I was thinking about the old JAS versus J Club rivalry. Alexis and I met an anime club in college, so we're also otaku. We're not throwing stones.
Right. I mean, part of both our much of the criticisms we are leveling at this book are being drawn out of a deep well of coming to grips with our problematic past selves.
Yes. But at our college, there were 2 Japan-oriented student groups, one of which was the Japanese Anime Society, which was us, and the other which was the J Club, who were the Japanese Culture Society. And we thought they were snobs who looked down on us, which they were. And and also we thought of them as people who had sort of, again, what's the word I want?
I don't know.
Uncritically picked up sort of ideas about Japanese culture from Japanese sources, and we're very happy to be like, oh, Nipponese Steel, Ichiban, best in the world kind of shit. Whereas we were at least a little bit more nuanced, or so we thought, even though we were the anime nerds.
Right, exactly.
So
So I'm really
nobody came out looking good.
Came out looking good, but I'm still really enjoying the fact that well over a decade, 2 decades later, you're still taking an opportunity to complain about J Club, which, to be honest, I had completely forgotten existed.
I hadn't thought of them for a while, but there's something about this book brought that whole thing back to me, Um, but anyway, that's a bit of a tangent.
You know, and
But
so
yeah, no, what?
I want to sort of draw both the gender thread and this thread together a little bit because, you know, the thing that got me into anime was that wow, here's media where you can see lots of girls with swords. Like I'd already read all of the available speculative fiction at the local bookstore and local libraries involving girls with swords, and you turn to anime and suddenly there's so many girls with swords and other cool weapons. And, you know, I think that I actually think that as we've been talking about this, it's really interesting because, you know, part of what is appealing about fascism is its incredibly strong normative gender roles. And yet, I think that part of what makes anime so attractive to a certain class of nerds is the fact that it offers alternate gender roles.
Yes, that is true. And even the barbarian fiction that we are talking about, like, Red Sonja is a thing. There have been female barbarians in this tradition, and
They have, but they're from my own culture, and so they were cringe.
oh well. But
But you know, I mean, the thing is that like Red,
the Xena warrior princess, right? Like these are, there's a holy shit. Sorry, I just opened the Wikipedia page for Red Sonja and got Escher girled incredibly hard.
right? And see, like that's part of the thing is that, and this really is about like separate cultural values, is that a lot of the, I at least at first I wasn't able to read a lot of the cultural signals, so I wasn't aware of all the many ways in which these cool girls with swords were being sexualized. So, like Red Sonja, it was obvious to me how she was being sexualized. And there are plenty of, incredibly busty women who are sex objects in anime. But there's other ways of fetishizing women that I was not attuned to. And so I could just be like, hey, this girl has a sword.
What's your favorite other way of fetishizing women? Are you more into Xena or into Gabrielle? Do you like him with glasses? Do you like him clean? Do you like them to smell? Do you like them indistinguishable from little girls? And if so, do you find yourself dating Asian women all the time? You should probably look into that. I'm just asking. This is true, and this is...
And this boy is so pretty.
This is part of the expat fantasy, right? Is like... If you go to the other place, but you keep yourself sufficiently removed that you can't see the strings, and you sort of intentionally isolate yourself to the degree where it's still all sort of spectacle and you can pretend that none of it is the same as every human endeavor ever, then, you can sort of live in this fantasy world, much as Tomoe does repeatedly throughout this book.
Yeah.
Before she turns her back on escapism of all kinds, including like happiness. And returns to the only thing that really matters, which is, as the book says, the necessity of mystery and danger.
And the sword.
The sword. I mean, there is something, even as I make fun of it, there's something like, inherently kind of attractive about this simplicity,
Yeah.
of doing your duty, because your duty must be done,
Right. And, and this sort of the appeal of a narrative of somebody who's been stumbling through one kind of illusion, from one kind of illusion to another, and then is physically dragged out of the most consuming illusion by her two girlfriends, who look at each other with a little bit of envy, and they're like, no, Tomoe Gozen has two hands. And, carry her out of the land of drunkenness and delusion. And then they just sort of step out of the narrative so that she can, defeat her sworn enemy who they admire each other. And he switched sides specifically so that they could finally meet on the battlefield as equals when she doesn't have two genders that are suspiciously Chinese.
Kate Beaton Nemesis comic goes here. Yeah, we want to make this interaction extremely uncomplicated. It's not, it's not a sex thing, you guys. Because Tomoe is, anyway. Except he is covered in jewels. He's extremely shiny. This guy. I have to say, there is one. Speaking of the lesbian part of this book, there is one thing in this book that I hadn't encountered before. Although I guess it's probably because I haven't been paying attention. But it's the idea that in this society, lesbianism is tacitly encouraged in order to make women good in bed.
Oh, I've absolutely encountered
enduring their virginity. I had somehow missed this. I know this must be out there in the zeitgeist, but like, is this like? Would you consider this a sort of an Orientalist idea?
Yeah, no. This is and this is actually very much a lesbian fantasy, or like, you know, Orientalism. And to be fair, it's not just Orientalism. You'll also hear this with things like, you know, like Western style polygamy, like fundamentalist Mormons or whatever. Is people imagine but it is especially true of it's a lesbian harem fantasy, right?
Right.
Where instead of the women being like, "Oh, a man, I've never seen one before," they're like, "Oh, a woman, you can teach me pleasure in a way that isn't dangerous."
Yes, I've certainly seen that floated before, but this book is very straightforward in the way it lays out its ideas, and I was like, "Thank you for just saying it,"
right?
You know? which is pretty common. I do want to say that, like, even though we've been spending all of our time, you know, talking about the various ways in which the book is problematic, because that's, I think, the most interesting thing about it. I liked the prose.
Yeah, no, like it's well written and it's genuinely entertaining.
The prose is good, but it does unironically use the word forsooth, like not a character, the actual narrative uses forsooth. So that's kind of the line that this is based on. But for that, it's good.
And it actually is surprisingly well structured for something that's so meandering.
If you're bored, just wait 10 pages.
Right.
Something else will come along. You know, we'll be fighting in a swamp.
Yep.
You know,
with a gay-coded
like,
kappa.
Oh yes, luring this man, the poor boy, to his doom via his anus.
To be fair, the kappa sucking your soul out through your anus is in fact a bona fide Japanese mythology thing.
Yes, but they don't normally look like that.
No, yeah. Oh, that's another thing we forgot to mention. Why should you read this book? Because it has pictures.
The illustrations. Yay! This is the first book that we've done that has pictures.
And the pictures they're really good, except that they are in fact quite racist.
Yes, but you know, you knew the job was dangerous as you took
right.
it. As soon as you picked up a book called Tomoe Gozen, written by somebody called Jessica in 1981, you knew what was going on. Actually, Samonson is more to the point. But yeah, no. Guy, I love the gay little kappa who is just a nude young man.
Yes.
With a little dent in his head.
Yes.
It's very good.
It is, and it's really interesting because in this book that has extremely homoerotic bonds of brotherhood, and you know, it like not even homoerotic, just like blatantly gay relationship between the feudal lady and her, you know, female samurai, and yet it also manages to have like sort of creepy, immoral, transgressive feeling gayness as well via this kappa.
Yeah, I mean, this is once again a, you know, if you want to say queer desire is the revolutionary force. I always like to remind people that, you know, there were among the higher ranks of Nazis, there were a lot of gay men, and they were sort of in their own camp, so to speak, next to the other camp. And it's like, this book is
that is a terrible pun with like 3 layers of awful.
Oh, I didn't get the third one. Sorry.
I mean, we're talking about this like campy gay kappa.
Yeah, no, it's true. But regardless, like there is a fascist streak to homosexuality.
Oh, that's
historically.
the pull quote.
And
If we ever get called out,
it's
going to
true.
be the pull quote is going to be Isaac saying there's a fascist streak to homosexuality, as opposed to that there's space for homosexuality inside certain kinds of fascism.
There's a way.
I'm sorry.
Historically. Okay, Jesus Christ. So when I say there's a fascist streak in homosexuality, what I mean is that there's a fascist streak in humanity, okay? Because gay people are people. They were in fact homosexual Nazis, but there have always been homosexual people everywhere. Gay people are no more inherently good or just than straight people. The closest thing the Nazis had to homosexual ideology was within the SA, or the Brown Shirts, under Ernst Röhm, who was gay and promoted masculinist ideals of love amongst men until he was purged in the Night of the Long Knives. His status as the first openly gay political figure was used both to smear Nazis with homosexuality and then later in the 1990s with a book of non-history called The Pink Swastika to smear homosexuality with its association with Nazism. But it must be stated that the Nazis killed Rome anyway, and then killed all the other queer people they could get their hands on, okay? Incidentally, in researching this, I discovered that the very minute the modern idea of homosexuality was codified in the early 20th century, fights immediately broke out between trans-inclusive, gender-as-a-spectrum type gays on the one hand, and gender-essentialist weren't the Spartans and Romans cool masculinist gays on the other. The two camps, if you'll excuse the expression again, had their own organizations and newsletters in place even before the First World War in Germany. This masculinist attitude is still present in gay men and women on the right, and has also been joined by a kind of gay Islamophobia, which posits that intolerance of immigration is the best way to protect tolerance at home. A big way that gay people engage in right-wing politics is through masculinism, and it's not just for men, which this book, which is the thing that we're theoretically discussing here, clearly demonstrates. There's a way...
I'm sorry.
Historically, in which homosexuality has been expressed through fascism.
Yukio Mishima.
Yes, he's right there. Say hello to Yukio. Do you know that he and Osamu Tezuka were born in the same year?
I did not.
It feels like Mishima's from further back than that somehow, doesn't it?
It does, and yet, when you think about it, like... He would not have had to do his dramatic suicide to restore the, militaristic Japan if militaristic Japan still existed.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are on a terrible
I really look
right
forward to all the explanatory jingles you're going to do for all these things. I really look forward to your explanatory jingle about Yukio Mishima, and I'm going to be really disappointed if there isn't one.
Okay, real quick, Yukio Mishima, Japanese gay novelist, poet, fascist, nationalist, born the same year as Osamu Tezuka, so he really didn't have an excuse. Killed himself, very much the Gact of his day. No, Gact is into Bushido. It's a whole thing in Shinto and animism, and yes, he's gay. He's obviously gay. He's like Liberace. He's got. Okay. I'll look up the Philip Glass songs and try to recreate them.
Yeah, okay, we've really gone off on a tangent. So let's spiral back in.
Spiraling back in, there is like the way that this book is okay, there is a right and a wrong way to be queer, and the right way is for Tomoe to be an extremely mask but definitely female, honor woman, is the right way, and the sort of swishy Kappa, the frail, wizard, and all of this other stuff,
that's the wrong
bad way.
Yes,
Exactly. So, remember that it's not, even though there's like this, we talk about homophobia being this underlying fear of feminization, um, and the breakdown of masculinity and the gender binary. You can do homosexuality without any of that. And there are some people who really like that to the exclusion of all else, like Mishima, for example.
Yeah. It's I lost my train of thought. I'm tired.
As am I, or I wouldn't have embarked on that in the first place.
Yeah, it's just, it is really interesting. I mean, because also you get to see so many different kinds of women in this book. And there's
Yes.
really no wrong way to be a woman in this book, except if you let yourself be subservient to a bad husband, when you're actually super powerful and a dragon goddess, and your husband is just some dude.
I mean, in a way, Tomoe kind of does the same thing with Juan, and
Right, like
but
there's
yes, no,
right,
that-
like the bad way to be a woman is to be subservient to a man. And okay, no, I remember
to an evil
to
man
an evil man
specifically.
specifically. Yes. Now I remember what my point was, which is that this is an interesting thing to follow up after Sappho's Bar and Grill, because Sappho's Bar and Grill is very much about sort of this a nostalgia for this time when, lesbianism was clean and pure and didn't have, and, the only transgressiveness was women acting masculine, but there was none of this other, like, uncomfortable gender, transgression stuff going on. And we noticed that a lot of the other retro stuff that Sappho's Bar and Grill was, theoretically nostalgic for, it really doesn't line up, except for the renunciates. But this
Right.
one,
But this one it does.
sort of.
Yeah.
But here's
Sort of.
the thing that all the false nostalgia people sort of get wrong, and that really, like, this is also why a lot of pastiche stuff is just really boring to me, is that it loses all the weirdness. Like, part of what, this book is really interesting, both as a thing to analyze and also just as a fun read.
A cultural artifact.
Yeah, it is a
and it's
cultural
funny.
artifact,
Yeah.
and just, as a read, because it's not afraid to just be deeply, deeply weird. And the thing with Sappho's Bar and Grill is, despite, there's so much potential for weirdness there, right? She's time traveling and hooking up with various lesbians throughout history, but it's just not that weird.
Yeah, it feels circumscribed by a set of political guidelines, even if they're not the same political guidelines that current wokeness would prescribe. Whereas this person does not care about any of that.
Right. It's, and okay, so maybe some of this is, the past is a foreign country, so maybe some of this is just that we're able to safely exoticize some of the stuff from the past, except that we're able to look at this as also being cringe. Though, cringe isn't inherently bad, it's the racism that makes it bad. But,
Yes.
no, but I feel like that is something, and we've seen this really with all the retro books, is that something that can make things interesting, that books don't actually have to be good or well constructed to be interesting, but you really the author has to be willing to just lean into all of their weirdnesses, all of their bizarre fetishes, all of their strange hang-ups and dramas and things that only they find interesting. And what will be produced may or may not be good, but it really will be interesting and, more to the point, compelling. In a way that, I feel like a lot of stuff a lot of stuff that is going through traditional publishing doesn't get the opportunity to be these days.
Amen. I am pumping my fist over here. I am going yes, sibling, yes. This is absolutely how I feel, and I think this is what has been. I mean, but strangely enough, this is even as the internet supposedly was meant to break down barriers to, of accessibility for, for people, and thus make the larger pool of voices more diverse. But in a way, that democratization and the way that it's been created, which is democratization via money, via like who you can get to pay for your shit, also means that things have become a lot more boring in some ways, at least in terms of the more polished and sort of formally presented stuff that you can find.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so
to be fair, there are creators out there who are not afraid to be weird. Shout out to Kiana, shout out to Lee, shout out to our guests. But I feel like, insofar as this podcast has a thing that we would like to advocate for, we would like books to be shorter and stranger.
I could not agree more.
So it's really good news that the author of The Fortunate Fall apparently has a book deal for a new book.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to that. And I think, like, as a corollary to that, even not to say another thing that might be a pull quote, but, I would like for authors to be able to put out bizarre, maybe problematic in like any number of ways stuff without being hounded off the face of the planet.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I would like nerds, particularly, and people who are interested in art and strange fiction, to stop trying to destroy the lives of people who are weird in ways they don't approve of.
Yes, I would like there to be space for things like Helicopter Story. Great, and
yes,
that's the pull quote
exactly.
that's going to get me called out.
I don't care anymore.
I know, right?
I'll say it. All right, I've done my best to make all my positions clear. But if you still want to cancel me, then here. Anyone who was involved in kiwi farms should be shot. And every gay furry they bullied off the internet for being into diapers should be given a $5,000 check and a knighthood.
But yeah, okay, and this is why.
Jessica Amanda Samuelson did nothing wrong. We stand.
Well,
that was
Jessica Amanda Samuelson did plenty of things wrong. But the thing is that also. And also, from what I vaguely remember, the second book in the saga is... I enjoyed it less. I don't remember anything about it except that Tomoe Gozen has a husband who she's super not into. And I think maybe he dies. No. I don't remember. So... I was 12. Maybe 13. Yeah. But, this is also sort of... We have to have space to forgive people when they screw up. And that also includes we have to have space to forgive our younger selves for being into stuff that was problematic because we didn't know. And also to, love our younger selves even if they were into stuff that was really cringy.
Exactly. And no matter how rude we are about the books, we are not upset that any of them are written and published, with the possible exception of... Battle of the Linguist Mages, and with the definite exception of Marion Zimmer Bradley.
But yeah, no, I mean, even the books that we criticize were still interesting enough for us to spend an hour talking about. And so, shout out to all...
You should see the ones that don't make the cut.
You shouldn't, they're boring. Shout out to all the authors. Thank you, authors. Even the ones whose books we've actually been really mean about. We do really appreciate that you're putting stuff out there that is interesting enough for us to complain about it.
Indeed. Like, even Sappho's Bar and Grill, that episode was a hoot, Yeah. But anyway, so next time on Wizards vs. Lesbians, what are we doing? I have forgotten.
Well... Maybe, I think honestly, that this is when we should do Chaos on Catnet, which we recorded a while ago, but I would like this to be, I think Tomoe Gozen should actually go closer to Sappho's Bar and Grill.
I agree. All right, so next time...
It's Chaos on Catnet, which we actually recorded 2 months ago.
Yes, and then and then probably even though I knew the end. But who
Oh
knows
yeah,
by the time.
yeah. Thank you to the person who recommended, even though I knew the end, which will be our next
Indeed.
one.
And can I just say that we've been getting a lot more sort of feedback on Tumblr and the Gmail box.
And we love it.
That's
Thank you
Wizards
so
vs.
much.
Lesbians on Tumblr and Wizards vs. Lesbians at Gmail. I appreciate every message we get, and your recommendations are always helpful. So thank you very much. And drop us a line if you want to.
Awesome. Thank you.
This book was dedicated to Akira Kurosawa, and the dedication page spelled Akira Kurosawa wrong.